In Kiawe's study, 495 people of the 1,000 identified Native Hawaiians completed his survey to measure which of the four groups in terms of culturalization they would fall into. That means 605 people did not complete it. And does that cause a problem? And if so, is that problem what we call a selection bias? In other words, the people we're selecting from this study, are they giving us a wrong answer, a biased result, because we have the wrong people in our study? So I want you to think about that for a second. And I also and it's the everyone's self.
Fran, we can't hear you at all. Can you go back and repeat yourself? We lost you from about like 20 seconds ago.
Let me go back to the previous slide. And the point I wanted to make is someone sent in a question about educational status of the participants in this study and the role that could have on the interpretation of the results we looked at in Figure 1. Aaron, can you just send me a chat to make sure you can hear me now, so I'll know whether I'm coming through. And so what I'd like to do is introduce 2 or 3 topics that we're going to be talking about in more detail in 2 weeks. And okay, Aaron, sounds good. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the notion of bias, a little bit about the notion of confounding, and a little bit about the role of statistical chance. So let me move on to the next slide. And I'm going to ask you 4 questions to consider. And we'll talk about these in much more detail in 2 weeks. But the first question deals with a potential of a problem called a selection bias. Kiawe had 1,100 Native Hawaiians who were surveyed previously. 495 of them completed his survey. That means 605 did not. Could the results we're getting from these 495 people be somehow misleading in terms of representing true associations from these 1,100 people? In other words, are the results from the 495 different from the results from the 605 that we didn't have? Could that be a problem? Second question deals with a different type of bias, one due to measurement. Everybody's answered this survey questions that Kiawe mentioned and grouped themselves into these 4 acculturation categories. But perhaps some people misunderstood the questions, or somehow maybe the information was miscoded. And there's a possibility that some of the people in these categories might have really belonged to one of the other 3 categories. And does that cause a problem? And then finally, 2 other questions to consider is that Kiawe collected information on age of the individuals, educational level, body mass index, the degree of Native Hawaiian ancestry, triglyceride levels, or levels. So could they be factors that you have to adjust for on this analysis as confounding factors, something we'll define in 2 weeks? And the last question to consider is what someone brought up already, that there are only 19 people in the marginalized group, only 8 people in the assimilated group. How does that affect your conclusions? So let's go back one last time, if I could, to Figure 1, and think about those 4 questions. Figure 1, remember, showed a higher prevalence among the traditional group. Now, the first point is that in the traditional group, Kiawe had 86 individuals out of the 495. The other 605 individuals who did not answer this survey would belong to one of these 4 groups. Each of them would be distributed over these 4 groups had that information been known. And is the fact that there are other people in the 1,100 people who were in the traditional group but not in this analysis, does that somehow invalidate this analysis? And the answer to that question, in my opinion, is I don't know. If those other people in the traditional group, in other words, were different from the 86 people in terms of their prevalence of diabetes, then it would be wrong to conclude that the 27.9% of diabetics among the 86 traditional people who answered this question represents the prevalence of diabetes in the other people, in the people who did not answer this questionnaire, who happen to be in the traditional group. And unfortunately, I don't know that. Now, when the original survey was done to all 1,100 people, or if you imagine if I'm knocking on your door and you answer it, and I'm asking if you'd be willing to be in this survey, if you answered no to me, before I left the door, I could see whether you are a male or a female. I could ask you what your age is. I might be able to collect some information on the 605 people who didn't answer this question, into this survey, to know if the 605 people who did not answer the survey are different from the 495 people who did. That might give me an idea of how representative my 495 people are of the larger 1,100.